Hi, my name is Dan McQuillan, and in today's talk I'm going to discuss the ideas from my book Resisting AI and how those ideas are playing out in the era of generative AI, and also what alternatives there are to seeing AI as inevitable. In the book, I try to take AI seriously as a form of computation, and I talk about what it is that it really does, what are the inner workings of AI, instead of what journalists or sociologists might imagine it is. But I also treat AI as something that is in society and not separate from it, trying to understand AI as entangled with social, institutional, and political dynamics. I wanted to dispense with the idea that AI is a sudden leap into a sci-fi future, to make it clear that it's not a clean break with the past, but arises out of the same messy histories as everything else. At the same time, I wanted to look at the specific ways that AI is modulating the present moment, to understand what it's going to amplify and intensify. The term I use in the book to describe these relationships between the technical and the social aspects of AI is resonances, and I'm going to talk about the resonances of AI and the ways they are changing people's lives. The first half of this talk will be very critical of AI, but I hope that even if you don't agree with it, you'll find some points for reflection. And I hope that the second half, which is about alternatives, will have something in it of interest to everyone. The first chapter in the book attempts to demystify the technical operations of AI. So it covers optimization and backpropagation, but also the mechanisms of data capture, the cloud infrastructure, and the labour relations that underpin AI. The chapter on collateral damage, which follows it, describes the social impacts that derive directly from these operations and the gradients of harm that will result from such brittle systems. In other words, the way that the people who will be hit the hardest by out-of-distribution errors or by proxy measures that completely miss contextual complexity are those who are already the most vulnerable or marginalised. It examines the implications of opacity for due process. What are the social implications of AI's predictions when it's not possible to truly extract a causal explanation from the weights of a neural network? The chapter paints a picture of AI as performative, meaning a system that actually produces that which it claims to predict, where supposed protections, such as the human in the loop, are overridden by the institution in the loop, where frictionless algorithms that align with corporate or agency goals operate without ethical doubt or empathy. The following chapter on AI violence develops this theme of what happens when AI's predictions become part of our everyday social structures. It tries to convey the way AI's abstractions and reductions are not well-founded ways of producing knowledge about the world, but extensions of long-standing mechanisms for rendering people, resources, and relationships available to mechanisms of value extraction through logics of speculation. The result of this is amplifying scarcity and making lives more precarious. The chapter argues that, rather than a sci-fi technology, AI is most like a souped-up form of bureaucracy. Both the generalised and goal-oriented systems, which are justified by claims of efficiency at scale, and act as ways of distancing decisions from their effects on the ground. as examples like the robo-debt scandal in Australia should have taught us, the net result will be the amplification of indifference and the scaling of injustice. On top of which, the operations of AI intensify racialization and other dividing practices. The repetitive re-emergence of deep learning solutions that are essentially forms of physiognomy, that is, ways of predicting essence from appearance, aren't random deviations, but warnings that AI is facilitating the return of race science. The chapter on necropolitics places these tendencies of AI in the contemporary moment. In particular, in the context of the austerity that has followed the financial crash of 2008, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and, of course, the ongoing climate crisis. It describes the way AI's preemptions can have the force of the law without being of the law, and how the resulting exclusions can become partial states of exception. That is, by crossing some statistical boundary that they may not even be aware of, people can be deprived of their rights to access, participate, or benefit without any means of recourse or accountability. The chapter notes the historical threads that link contemporary AI to eugenics, from the development of statistical regression by the Victorian eugenicists Galton and Pearson, through to the creation of the concept of general intelligence, which is the G in AGI, as part of the weaponization of metrics like IQ to justify social and racial hierarchies. The chapter warns that AI's application to social ranking and optimization risks becoming part of the re-emergence of eugenics. The chapter sums up these effects as a form of necropolitics, following the term coined by theorist Achille Mbembe. That is, a form of politics that modifies the distribution of life chances through designations of relative disposability. While the massive expansion in generative AI happened after the book was published in the summer of 2022, it mostly served to reinforce the arguments that I've already made, while adding some specific issues of its own. Although transformer models are complex and recursive architectures, because their task is to emulate word patterns that are contextual enough for us to read meaning into them, their underlying mechanism is still connectionist forms of pattern finding based on abstract correlations, whose dependency on exponential scaling requires the massive exploitation of other people's labour and creativity. Generative AI's capacity to increase precarity is actually marketed as a virtue by, for example, substituting $90 an hour nurses with $9 an hour synthetic avatars. But there's no capacity in these models to deal with the ever-shifting contexts of lived experience. So LLMs will never do most of the things that are claimed of them. They will just do what they're built to do, which is produce sequences of plausible tokens whose facticity is irrelevant to the algorithm. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean they don't work. It just means that we will have to shift our understanding of what works means. Because yes, AI does work. It works to transform social structures and subjectivities, and it works to concentrate control and to dilute critical thought. In the UK, for example, it works to legitimate government investment in so-called educational AI, instead of fixing the literally collapsing roofs in schools, while at the same time using apps based on deep learning to assess students as collections of preemptible risks. While it seems pretty clear that large language models are a bubble built on foundational flaws, they are still acting as a form of shock doctrine, where the sense of world-changing urgency that accompanies them transforms social systems without democratic debate. As more vital functions of society become dependent on the models and cloud infrastructure of big tech, the resulting privatization and bureaucratic cruelty towards the most vulnerable look far less like something new, and more like, in a UK context, a form of what we might call algorithmic Thatcherism. To me, the need here is not to debate deep-seated cultural memes about superintelligence, or abstract forms of utilitarian ethics that ignore the here and now in people's lives, but to understand the unreasonable effectiveness of these reductive and regressive technologies in marshalling off-the-scale levels of resources and commitment. Because then we will better understand the world we're in and what needs to be done. The other factor that generative AI has accelerated is the awareness of the materiality of AI and its relationship to environmental issues and the climate crisis. Data centres were already key to the scaling of AI's social impacts, by enabling, for example, predatory innovations like Uber to channel venture capital into campaigns of deregulation, underpinned by the availability of elastic computing resources. But now we need to focus on the direct impacts of data centres themselves. While again this is something that I discussed in Resisting AI, the rapid refitting and expansion of hyperscale data centres packed with generative AI-friendly GPUs like the NVIDIA 8100 is bringing it to the fore. These data centres are seriously thirsty. They need vast amounts of water to cool their ever hotter server clusters, sucking up water resources in places like Nevada, even when local towns are struggling for supply. In the Swedish city of Malmö, Microsoft booked so much electricity from the grid for its data centre that the local Swedish bread company could no longer build a baking factory. In the UK, West London faces a new homes ban because too much of the grid is already taken by data centres, who run their cables back along the M4 motorway and into the Atlantic. Data centres deplete whatever communities and ecologies are unlucky enough to host them. AI isn't just a challenge for our basic infrastructures, it's taking them over. Unfortunately, the environmental harms of AI aren't limited to resource capture or to direct carbon emissions. AI services are aggressively marketed to the fossil fuel industry, while at the same time being promoted as the main way to legitimate greenwashing technologies, meaning engineering solutions that claim to solve climate change without addressing any of the underlying economic or political structures. It seems that all these high-tech fake fixes are in some way or other going to be powered by AI. The point isn't that AI itself simply has dependencies that need to be made more efficient, so we can benefit from its bounties, but that the extractive mechanisms that I've already described and AI's assertion of authority on levels of both material resources and meaning make AI a form of recursive colonialism. So I think it's pretty clear that on this analysis of AI, the remedy isn't fairness or ethics or trustworthy AI or responsible AI. And in the chapter on post-machinic learning in Resisting AI, I explore ways to build an alternative understanding of the world that doesn't rush down the destructive path that led to AI. To do this, I draw on feminist and post-colonial critiques of science to challenge the abstract view of algorithms, to highlight the importance of situated and embodied knowledge, and to emphasize the relational nature of knowing. I combine standpoint theory with its emphasis on starting analysis from marginalized lives with post-normal science, as shown here, which says that in situations with uncertain facts and disputed values, the way forward isn't more statistical methods, but a massively expanded idea of peer community. The chapter also argues that rather than building a set of representations, AI is part of an apparatus that acts to produce aspects of the world at the level of the separation between matter and meaning. The chapter ends by positioning the concept of care as the necessary counter to AI's abstractions and exclusions. The realization that knowledge of the world is relational is a way to overcome the division between knowing and caring. Having tried to open up the possibility of epistemological alternatives in the chapter on post-machinic learning, the chapter on people's councils connects the ideas of post-machinic learning to mechanisms of actual change. A tactic for these changes is mutual aid, which challenges AI's exclusions both practically and philosophically, embracing our entanglement not only as a reaction to need, but as a ground for action. Avoiding algorithmic capture means reviving historical forms of self-organisation, such as workers' and people's councils, opposing AI's automatised hierarchies with horizontal autonomy, echoing, for example, the Lucas plan of the 1970s, where workers in a giant arms company prototyped alternatives from wind generators to hybrid vehicles, while radically democratising their workplace at the same time. A contemporary example is the former GKN automotive axle factory near Florence in Italy, which has been occupied via a permanent assembly of workers after the UK private equity fund that owned it tried to shut it down. Organising under the anti-fascist partisan slogan Insorgiamo, let's rise up, they have joined in solidarity research with local academics and climate activists and created a plan to produce cargo bikes and photovoltaic panels that use very little lithium and cobalt. If my previous slides made concrete AI's role in the precaritization of lives on the one hand and environmental destruction on the other, then the GKN collective shows the potential for what we call a just transition, and a transition from the bottom up. Now, as far as I know, there's no AI involved here, either in the original plant or in the community's plans. But I think it says a lot about a truly techno-political response to AI. If, as I would understand it, AI is an apparatus whose operational predictions actually produce aspects of the world at the level of separation between material and agency, then an alternative apparatus must support the recomposition of collective subjects alongside technical practices for the common good. As you may have caught sight on one of the early slides, the subtitle of the book, Resisting AI, is An Anti-Fascist Approach to AI. Now, I realise that the term anti-fascist has been demonised in an American context. But I'd argue that finding ways to put post-machinic learning into practice is to take an anti-fascist approach to AI, because it blocks the possibility of necropolitics and eugenics turning into fascistic solutionism, while at the same time building positive alternatives to the status quo. Resisting AI doesn't claim that AI is fascist, but argues that its operations of essentializing difference, of enabling transformative violence and states of exception, tend to amplify the currents of microfascism that are already present in so many aspects of society. The purpose of resistance to AI is to generate constructive proposals about positive alternatives and how to bring them into being. In the book, I propose socially useful production, solidarity economies, and notions of the commons as the engines of this structural renewal. That is, the construction of forms of the new society in the shell of the old. I think if AI shows us anything, it's that there's an urgent need to figure out a prefigurative technopolitics. That is, forms of action in the here and now that change our technical and social arrangements at the same time, in line with visions of a more just and sustainable society. One lesson from existing struggles against algorithmic injustice is that the only opposition prepared to really throw a spanner in the machinic hybrid of algorithms and bureaucracy is the ordinary people who are affected by it. How can we help their struggles become the outline of a new apparatus? One possibility is the forgotten side of cybernetics, like Stafford Beer's viable systems model, which can be a technical and a social pattern at the same time, with its operations of recursive autonomy, which reject the view from above, in favour of principles of unknowability, complexity, and adaptive interaction. Another important strand, I think, is what I'd call decomputing. That is, computing within limits, which invokes care for life through low-power infrastructure and an approach that starts from salvage and repair. This addresses the material harms of AI infrastructure, but also challenges the way computing solutionism can block alternative ways of tackling a problem and actually prevent structural change. In this way, decomputing is something that works alongside ideas of degrowth. Above all, we need a resistance to AI. Resistance that is grounded in an empirical understanding of tech and the real threats to lives and livelihood that come from AI's takeover of healthcare, welfare, and warfare, but rejects the P-doom fantasies that use sci-fi narratives of conscious or unconscious defence of existing privilege. We don't need solipsistic utilitarianism based on pseudo-scientific probabilities, but real solidarity with those who are already struggling with structural injustice, whose struggles are intensified by AI. We need a technopolitical vision that leaves behind the dystopian tech worlds of cyberpunk, which is what we're living in right now, and learns more from solarpunk's clear-eyed but counter-dystopian vision and more than human affinities, where the multiple crises of the status quo aren't an apocalyptic endpoint, but an opening and an invitation, because other worlds are still possible. Thanks very much. If you would like to get in touch, here are my contact details.